Imagine a world with no bedroom doors to close, no private corners, no secrets. Now, picture this shocking scene from 14th century England. A wife stands accused in a church court of committing intimacy with her husband, times behind the bread oven asterisk. Not because they were being daring, but because their one-room home, packed with children, relatives, and servants, offered no other concealed space. Meanwhile, in Essex, a servant girl testifies under oath that she hears her master and mistress's intimate moments every single night, separated from them by nothing more than a thin, worn cloth hanging from a beam. This wasn't scandalous behavior. This was normal medieval marriage. How did couples find moments of intimacy when every breath, every whisper, every rustle of straw was public property? The answer reveals a shocking history of love, defiance, and the desperate human need for connection in a world without walls. Let's step inside that one-room home. It's midnight. The fire in the central hearth is now just embers, casting flickering shadows on the wattle and daub walls. The air is thick and stale, heavy with the smell of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and the goat tied near the doorway. In the profound, suffocating darkness, 10, maybe 12 people sleep on a shared mattress of straw laid directly on the dirt floor. Children, grandparents, a servant, all tangled together under coarse wool blankets. There are no pillows, no partitions, and the concept of a door to shut is a fantasy from a future century. This was the reality for the majority of medieval peasants, a life documented in 13th century land records that describe the open hall as the standard dwelling, with probate inventories matter-of-factly listing one bed for all as completely normal. The architecture of these homes made privacy physically impossible. Most peasant dwellings measured no more than 20 by 30 feet smaller than many modern living rooms. The walls, made of woven sticks and mud, were porous to both air and sound. In northern regions like Scandinavia, families shared their longhouses with livestock throughout the harsh winters, creating an environment where human and animal sounds, smells, and body heat intermingled in one continuous, chaotic symphony. Archaeological evidence from sites like Warham Percy in England reveals floor plans showing no internal divisions, with hearths positioned centrally and sleeping areas radiating outward in what can only be described as a human pile. In this world, day and night bled into a continuous public performance. The rough wooden table you ate your gruel from at noon was the same surface you slept beside at night. Children were swaddled in the very same scratchy, flea-ridden blankets that covered their parents. During winter, the family huddled together for a grim reason: survival. The body heat was a necessary defense against a cold that could kill. Privacy wasn't just a luxury, it was a concept that hadn't been invented yet. This cramped, noisy, sensory-overloaded space was the stage upon which marriage had to be performed, where love had to find a way to breathe in the stale air, and couples had to find each other in the dark, under the weight of everyone listening. Think your wedding night is stressful? In many medieval communities, it was a public spectacle. The bedding ceremony was a common ritual where friends, family, and neighbors would literally escort the newly married couple to their shared pile of straw, cheering and joking as they watched them get into bed together. This was not about romance. It was a legal and social formality, a public confirmation that the marriage had been consummated. In some German villages, the tradition went even further. Guests would remain in the room until they heard specific sounds confirming the marriage's completion. For those not subjected to this ritual, the challenges were just as immense. Beyond the court case of the couple behind the bread oven, consider the sheer, grinding lack of secrecy. Every cough, every creak of the floorboard, every whispered word was community knowledge. The psychological impact of this constant surveillance must have been profound. We can only imagine the anxiety, the suppressed desires, the stolen glances that had to substitute for private conversation. Court records from medieval France reveal cases where couples were fined for excessive noise during intimacy, while in England, some villages had official listeners who would patrol at night to enforce moral codes. The very architecture of life was designed to prevent privacy, making every personal moment subject to public scrutiny and judgment. So, how did they manage the marriage debt that the church insisted upon? Intimacy became a covert operation, planned with the precision of a military raid. Parents would lie awake for hours, waiting for the specific rhythm of the children's breathing to deepen into sleep, for the grandfather's snoring to become a predictable drone, for the house to achieve a fragile, false quiet. Some couples waited for market days, when the house might be empty for a few precious hours. Others, driven by need or exhaustion, did not wait at all. They moved under the heavy blankets with stifled voices and painstakingly slow movements, operating on a silent, universal understanding that everyone in the room was likely awake and aware. In one sense, love in this era was never alone, but in another, more profound sense, it was never truly free. The church's influence extended far beyond Sunday sermons. Local priests would regularly question married couples about their intimate lives during confession, asking pointed questions about frequency, positions, and whether they derived too much pleasure from the act. Manuals for confessors, such as the 13th century Summa Confessorum, provided detailed instructions on what questions to ask and what penances to assign for various sexual transgressions, even within marriage. This created an environment where couples not only had to navigate physical lack of privacy, but also the constant fear of spiritual condemnation for natural marital relations. But human ingenuity is relentless. When you cannot build a wall from timber or stone, you build one from fabric. In a world where building materials were precious, a simple piece of cloth became a revolutionary tool for privacy. These weren't delicate veils. They were thick, heavy woolen blankets, often patched and repatched over decades, sometimes lined with cheap fur for warmth, strung across a beam or nailed roughly into a rafter. Did they block sound? Absolutely not. A servant girl could still testify to what she heard, but they created a powerful psychological illusion of separation. For a couple, that hanging cloth was a fortress. It was a place to undress without a dozen eyes watching, to whisper secrets, to reach out and touch without being seen. It was the difference between being a public spectacle and having a sliver of a private life. The evolution of bed curtains tells a fascinating story of social aspiration and technological innovation. Initially, these were simple wool cloths, but by the 14th century, we see evidence of more sophisticated arrangements. Wealthier households might have curtains on wooden rails that could be drawn back and forth, while innovative pulley systems allowed curtains to be raised during the day to save space. The dyes used in these fabrics became status symbols, rich reds from madder root, deep blues from woad, showing that even in privacy, social hierarchy expressed itself. The very language used to describe these spaces evolved too, with terms like solar, from the French sol, meaning alone, entering common usage to describe private sleeping areas. By the 15th century, this desperate need for separation started appearing in official documents. Wealthier peasants began listing bed curtains in their household inventories, right beside their most valuable cooking pot and iron tools. This is critical proof that even in a world built on communal living, privacy was a desired, valued commodity. In towns, apprentices slept head to toe in crowded attics, while the master and his wife always claimed the only curtained bed. Then came the ultimate status symbol, the four-poster bed. This wasn't just furniture, it was architecture. It was a room within a room, a cave of warmth and darkness enclosed by heavy drapes, a space where touch and breath could finally belong to just two people, and not the 10 others in the room. For most, however, the reality was a curtain over a corner, a blanket pinned to a beam, or a screen of bundled reeds. The goal wasn't to block the world out entirely, but to desperately hold something of their own in, just for a moment. The four-poster bed represented a revolution in domestic privacy. Early examples from the 14th century were crude structures, but by the Tudor period, they had become elaborate constructions with carved canopies, silk hangings, and even small storage compartments built into the posts. The wealthy would invest astonishing sums in these beds, often the most valuable item in their household, recognizing them as essential for both comfort and propriety. Some historical accounts suggest that the bed curtains served not only for privacy, but also for physical protection against drafts, insects, and even the occasional falling debris from thatched roofs. In this world of communal living, privacy wasn't a place you found, it was a skill you practiced. Intimacy was not spontaneous passion, it was a strategized, covert mission. Couples became grand masters of reading the room's subtle rhythm. They knew the exact moment the baby fell into a deep sleep. They noted when a neighbor left for the market, creating a golden window of relative quiet. They learned to love in the deep silence that fell when the fire burned down to embers. Silence itself became their most powerful tool, a secret language, an unspoken promise. Speaking was a risk, but a single glance across the room at dusk could be an entire conversation. They developed covert signaling systems. A turned-up shoe by the doorway, a lantern placed in a specific spot on the windowsill. These were silent messages of, "The coast is clear," or "Danger, stay away." The strategies varied by season and region. In Mediterranean countries, the siesta hour provided opportunities when the heat drove others outdoors. In fishing villages, the pre-dawn departure of fishermen created brief windows of privacy. Some couples developed elaborate systems using household objects, a particular arrangement of firewood, the positioning of a broom by the door to signal when the house would be empty. These weren't romantic gestures, but necessary adaptations to an environment that offered no natural privacy. In households with servants, the planning became even more complex. You might have to invent an urgent errand or feign a sudden illness to send a servant away. Others exploited the natural scattering of the family for chores, the 20 minutes to fetch water, the hours spent tending animals, and for those on farms, outbuildings became secret havens. A dark corner behind sacks of barley in the barn, a shadowed nook near the chicken coop. These weren't romantic spots. They were stolen, desperate moments carved from the relentless noise of survival. Even the seasons played a role. Winter, for all its brutality, offered one mercy: long, deep hours of darkness. The house quieted sooner, people slept longer, and in that cold collective stillness, couples found their narrow, fragile window of opportunity. No doors, no locks, but somehow a flicker of privacy survived. The risks of seeking privacy outdoors were substantial. Beyond the obvious discomfort of cold and damp, there was real danger from animals, thieves, and the elements. Church court records from medieval Germany tell of couples being attacked by wolves while seeking solitude in forest areas. In England, several tragic accounts describe lovers who succumbed to exposure after being locked out of their villages after curfew. Yet, despite these dangers, the drive for privacy pushed people to take remarkable risks, highlighting how fundamental this need was to human dignity and relationships. Unsurprisingly, your experience of intimacy was dictated by your wealth. For the poor, the one-room house was an inescapable universe. But for the wealthy lords, merchants, prosperous farmers, privacy was a physical marker of status. Some late medieval homes featured a solar, a separate upper room where the lord and lady could retreat, a door, a lock, a fireplace of their own. For the first time, a space where love could unfold without witnesses. Inventories from 14th century Kent show separate bedchambers with curtains, linen sheets, and chests for personal items, while the poor laborer still slept by the hearth, the baby's cradle knocking against his legs. Yet, even in castles, privacy was relative. Walls were thin, servants listened at doors, and gossip traveled fast. Privacy was never absolute. It was scaled, shaped, and bought. The evolution of noble housing reveals a fascinating progression toward privacy. Early medieval castles featured great halls where everyone slept together, much like peasant dwellings. But by the 12th century, we see the introduction of private chambers for the lord and lady, often accessed by separate staircases. By the 15th century, wealthy merchants in cities like London and Bruges were building homes with multiple specialized rooms, including dedicated bedrooms on upper floors. This architectural shift reflected changing attitudes toward family life, personal space, and the very nature of intimacy itself. So what happened when even the curtains and the strategies failed? When the house was too full, too loud, too suffocating? You left. You braved the cold and the dark. Many couples, especially young lovers, sought privacy where no one lived, in drafty barns, cold bakehouses, or at the terrifying edge of the forest. Church court records are filled with stories of sin committed near the stables or fleshly acts behind the mill wall. These aren't tales of passion, they are records of necessity. Village guards patrolling at night would catch lovers in fields or behind hedges. Punishments were severe: public whippings, heavy fines, social shame. Yet the behavior never stopped. The geography of secret intimacy reveals much about medieval community life. Certain locations became known as meeting spots: the lover's lane behind the churchyard, the secluded clearing in the common wood, the storage shed at the field's edge. In some villages, an unspoken understanding developed where certain spaces were tacitly acknowledged as private, despite official prohibitions. This created a complex landscape of public morality and private practice, where communities simultaneously condemned and accommodated the human need for intimacy. For married couples, this wasn't about sin, it was survival. If the home was too crowded, love had to become nomadic. A 15th century record from Norfolk tells of a couple who lay together on a sack of wheat behind the granary door, while their house was full of guests. In a world built against privacy, every act of closeness was a quiet act of defiance. These weren't romantic assignations, but desperate measures taken by people determined to maintain some semblance of personal connection against overwhelming odds. And looming over it all were the ever-watchful eyes and ears of the church and the law. Medieval intimacy was never a private matter. It was regulated, observed, and judged. The church spoke endlessly about sex, but rarely of love. Intimacy was permitted only for procreation. Desire for pleasure was suspicious. Confession manuals from the 13th century instructed priests to ask couples if they had embraced with excessive fondness or spoken wanton words. Guilt was measured not only by action, but by intention. Ecclesiastical courts thrived on gossip. A Norwich record from 1442 has a neighbor testifying that a couple were joined after dark while her mother snored. Walls were thin, floors creaked, and people listened. Sometimes it was malice, sometimes curiosity, but someone always knew. Intimacy, therefore, was a constant, quiet rebellion against judgment, shame, and the ever-present ear pressed to the wall. The Church's regulation of marital intimacy created what modern historians call a culture of surveillance. Neighbors were encouraged to report on each other's sexual behavior, and church wardens kept detailed records of moral infractions. In some parishes, couples were required to explain extended absences from church, with suspicion falling on those who might be engaging in intimacy at inappropriate times. This created an environment where the most personal aspects of life became subject to community scrutiny and control. But in the end, the night offered a final rare gift. Not privacy, but mercy. When the last candle guttered out, when voices faded into sleep, when the cold settled and the dark became absolute, the world forgot. In that profound silence, couples found slivers of tenderness. A hand slipped into another, a breath warmed against a neck. Words whispered so softly, even the mice in the straw couldn't hear. No one saw, no one judged. These weren't grand passions, they were small mercies. A husband kissing his wife's work-roughened fingers as frost formed on the window. A mother reaching across the straw just to know her partner was still there. There, in that sacred hush, love endured. Not with fire or poetry, but with patience and stillness. And the darkness, for once, kept its promise. To cover, not to condemn. The psychological resilience required for love to survive these conditions is staggering. Modern research on privacy emphasizes its importance for healthy relationships and individual well-being. Medieval couples had to find ways to create emotional intimacy without the physical spaces we consider essential today. Their success in maintaining bonds despite these challenges speaks to the adaptability of human connection and the profound need for love to find a way, regardless of circumstances. Privacy didn't arrive overnight. It seeped in slowly. By the late 16th century, blueprints changed. Wealthier homes fractured into separate chambers: a hall, a kitchen, a bedroom, a withdrawing room. Architecture began to serve intimacy. Walls were built for silence. Sleeping areas moved upstairs. Doors began to lock. For the poor, change was slower, but came in small steps. Better partitions, corner beds, chimneys to clear smoke, glass for windows. As privacy became a structure, intimacy found a new place to breathe without shame, witness, or interruption. This was a shift not just in space, but in the very nature of love. The transition to private living spaces revolutionized family life. With the advent of separate bedrooms, childhood emerged as a distinct life stage rather than simply a smaller version of adulthood. The concept of romantic love transformed from something practiced communally to something cultivated in private. The very way people thought about themselves changed as well, with individualism flourishing once people had physical spaces to be alone with their thoughts. So how did they do it? How did couples find intimacy in one-room homes? They didn't wait for space, they made it. They carved out privacy with curtains, glances, and the rhythm of daily life. They loved without doors or distance, and somehow, against the cold noise and constant presence of others, they loved deeply, quietly, persistently, not because they had privacy, but because they needed each other more than they needed comfort. Love survived because two people chose to see only each other, even with the world watching. And perhaps that defiant focus is what made it last. The next time you close your bedroom door, remember them. The ones who had none of it, and still found a way. The legacy of medieval intimacy lives with us today in ways we rarely acknowledge. Our modern concept of privacy, our valuation of personal space, even our understanding of what makes a relationship intimate, all were shaped by this centuries-long struggle. The medieval experience reminds us that privacy is not just a physical condition, but a state of mind, and that human connection can flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. Their story is ultimately one of resilience, creativity, and the enduring power of love to find a way even when there are no walls to hide behind.